When the friends gathered for this hike, everything seemed normal. They decided that they needed to get away from city life and spend time in the wilderness. No phones, no internet, no noise of the metropolis. Nature was supposed to be a salvation for them from everyday worries, a little adventure that they had been planning for a long time. They had known each other for many years. Steve, Mike, and Alex. The trio went out into nature more than once, but usually it was one-day trips to the nearest forests. This time, they decided to take a week off and go away. The place was chosen carefully. A remote area of the forest where there was no communication, and the nearest city was several dozen kilometers away. They were confident that with such hiking experience and survival skills, they could handle any situation. Before the trip, they bought everything they needed: tents, food, equipment. Mike even offered to take some self-defense equipment, just in case. It was his idea, because he was most worried about possible dangers in the wild. The others laughed at him, but accepted the idea. "It's better to be safe," he said, packing pepper spray and a knife into his backpack. The first day of the hike was surprisingly calm. They reached the place, set up tents, and built a fire. Nature was majestic and peaceful. The forest surrounding them was old and dense, but they felt safe. In the evening, the guys sat around the campfire, discussed their plans, who would do what, how they would spend the next week. Alex, the most experienced tourist, suggested going deep into the forest the next day to explore new territory. Everyone liked the idea. However, in the morning, everything did not go so smoothly. When they woke up, they noticed that one of the tents was slightly raised and there were footprints on the ground. Not human and not animal, but some kind of strange, as if someone or something had silently sneaked past them at night. "Yeah, it's just some kind of animal," Mike said confidently, but none of them could tell exactly who it was. They laughed, but there was tension in the air. The friends gathered and went to the forest as planned. After a couple of hours of walking, they came across an old abandoned hunting hut. It looked long abandoned, with a sagging roof and overgrown entrances. But what surprised them most was that the door was slightly ajar. There was no one inside, but there was a mess around, as if someone had left the place in a hurry. "Maybe the local hunters just left her like that?" Alex suggested, but something about this place was alarming. When they returned to the camp, another unpleasant surprise awaited them. Things were scattered, and on one of the chairs there was a note written crookedly and blurrily. "You are not alone here. Go away." The note sent an instant chill through everyone's skin. "This is some kind of joke," Steve tried to assure the others, but there was doubt in his voice. Deciding not to pay attention, they continued their trek. But after a few hours, they came across footprints leading to their camp. Now the situation no longer seemed normal to them. Their peace was disturbed. With every step they took in the forest, they began to feel more exposed. "Something's obviously wrong," Mike said softly as they walked back to the camp. He suggested leaving the forest, returning to the car and forgetting about this hike. But Alex and Steve decided to stay. They refused to believe that this was something serious. And so, in the evening, they hear the first strange sounds coming from the depths of the forest. At first, there are quiet footsteps, as if someone is making their way through the thicket, but every time they shine their lanterns, no one is visible. Mike is getting more and more nervous, and the tension within the company is growing. Night falls quickly, and in the dark, the forest seems more hostile than in the daytime. That's when they realize they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. It's not just a coincidence. Someone or something is watching them, moving quietly and unnoticed until they can escape. They spent the night on edge. Alex, as the most confident, offered to take turns on duty. They split the time into 3 shifts, but that didn't make anyone feel any better. During his shift, Mike heard rustling in the bushes several times. "I shone my flashlight there, but I didn't see anything." This went on until his shift came to an end and he woke Alex up. However, in the morning, Mike admitted that he barely closed his eyes. Every sound caused him anxiety, and even the usual noises of the forest seemed ominous. Alex, on the other hand, remained relatively calm. He was sure it was either some kind of local animal or a joke. But even he could not explain the note, which, as it turned out in the morning, had disappeared. At first, Steve thought Mike had just hidden it, but Mike looked too worried for such a harmless joke. When they were about to continue the hike, Alex suggested that they move away from the camp a little to make sure that all this really was nothing more than random events. He took a knife and pepper spray with him, in case they met something real. Steve and Mike stayed at the camp. An hour passed without incident while Alex was in the woods. Steve and Mike were sitting around the campfire at the time, trying to distract themselves from what had happened the day before. They discussed going home. Mike was increasingly insistent on ending this hike right now, but Steve was hesitant. Deep down, he didn't want to seem like a coward in front of his friends, and Alex, besides, had always been a role model for him. He couldn't give up so easily. And then something caught their attention. A shadow flickered at the edge of the forest. It wasn't Alex. The figure was moving too fast and almost noiselessly, hiding among the trees. Mike jumped up abruptly and grabbed for the knife, feeling panic begin to take hold of him. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Steve didn't answer right away, but his face paled. "I saw it. It's not Alex." They decided not to go far from the camp, but stood ready. A few more minutes passed, and suddenly there was a loud crackling of branches from the forest, as if someone was running at them. In a panic, Mike pulled out a canister and pointed it in the direction of the noise. But when Alex ran out of the bushes, both breathed a sigh of relief. "What's the matter with you?" Alex asked in disbelief when he saw their tense faces. They told him about the shadow, and although he tried to remain calm, a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. He knew this forest better than any of them, and understood that there were no large animals that could move like that. "And if it's not an animal?" he said thoughtfully. This phrase hung in the air. Everyone fell silent, exchanged tense glances, and then Alex suggested that they go back to the car anyway. The decision was made, and they quickly began to assemble the camp. But as they set off on their way back, the path began to seem strange. The forest they knew so well seemed to have changed. They tried to check the map several times, but each time they found themselves in the same place. Even Alex started to get nervous, which clearly indicated that the situation was getting out of control. Alex and Steve stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by a silence that seemed even worse than the noises they had heard before. Steve looked around nervously, expecting that at any moment something would rush at them from the darkness. Alex was clutching the knife, but his hands were shaking and his eyes were darting in search of Mike's tracks. "We need to get out of here now," Alex said, his voice taut as a string. "We can't help Mike if we die ourselves." But Steve couldn't just walk away. He was screaming, "Alex, we can't leave him," he cried out in despair. "Do you think I don't know that?" Alex whirled on him, and his voice rose to a scream. "But look around. We are being led by the nose. There's something wrong with this place. We can't save him if we fall into this trap ourselves." Alex's words sounded cruel, but logic told him he was right. Steve was still hesitating, but then he nodded slowly. "Okay, let's go." They started on their way back, but now the steps were fast and nervous, their heads constantly spinning, expecting something terrible. The forest seemed to be getting thicker and more hostile by the minute. They no longer tried to navigate the map. They just moved forward, trying to somehow escape from this frightening trap. An hour passed, maybe two, and they were back in the same place they had started from, near an abandoned hut. This time, the door was wide open. There was no light or noise inside, but there was a feeling of something wrong in the air. Alex looked at the cabin, then at Steve, as if asking if it was worth going inside. "We've been walking in circles for hours. This is the only place to hide," Steve said, trying to sound confident, even though his heart was pounding so hard it seemed like it was about to burst out. Alex nodded reluctantly. They entered the hut cautiously, weapons at the ready. It was dark and damp inside and smelled of rot and mold. But something has changed since their last visit. There was another note on the table that had been overturned at the first meeting. Alex slowly walked over and read aloud, "You should have left earlier." Suddenly, they heard footsteps outside. They both froze. Someone or something was approaching. Alex signaled Steve to turn off the flashlight, and they hid in a corner of the hut, trying not to breathe. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. Then they heard something or someone breathing heavily. Steve, barely restraining his panic, whispered, "What is it?" Alex just shook his head, his face wet with sweat. But when the cabin doors creaked open slowly, Steve couldn't stand it. He rushed to the window, trying to break it down to escape. Alex tried to stop him, but it was too late. The window shattered, and Steve jumped out, losing his balance and falling to the ground. He jumped up and ran into the woods without looking back. Alex shouted, "Steve, come back!" But his scream was drowned out in the darkness. Now he was alone in this hut. His heart was pounding in his chest. He knew that whatever was standing by the door must have heard the noise. Alex braced himself for the worst. But a few minutes passed and no one came in. Silence surrounded him again, but this time it was even more ominous. Alex, summoning all his willpower, slowly left the hut. There was only night and darkness around. Steve was nowhere to be seen. He started to call out to him, but there was silence in response. He couldn't stay here any longer. Alex ran, biting into the forest trails. He didn't know where he was or where he was running to. His feet carried him further and further until lights flashed in front of him. This is the road. Alex felt a surge of relief when he saw the headlights of a car in the distance. He ran with all his might, knowing that salvation was near. But when he reached the road, a figure froze in front of him. It was Steve. He stood in the headlights, his face as pale as marble, and his eyes were empty. "Steve?" Alex screamed. Steve turned his head slowly, but something in his expression made Alex stop. It wasn't his friend. Steve's face contorted and blood gushed from his mouth.